Afternoon, guys. I'm just checking in video 3 on Unit 1. Before I get going with video 3, I just wanted to give another shout out here to College Board. Advanced Placement through College Board is doing these live videos. I post about them. I don't know how many of you guys are seeing the post or watching any of these videos, but they're doing live reviews with teachers that teach the course. You can see here the one yesterday was 44 minutes long. Um, just to clarify, you're seeing that they're doing some review on Unit 5 when I said the test is going to be on Units 1 through 3. That is correct. The thing is that they made an agreement with colleges that you still need to know information about Unit 5. So that's where that part's coming from. But to get back to our review here, today Big Ideas 3 and 4. I might make a fourth video with the end of Big Idea 4 because it's pretty big. But remember, Unit 1 is kind of all about the foundations of American government. So that third big idea here, Constitution makes competitive policy-making process to ensure the people's will is represented and freedom is preserved. And two really big and simple ideas that you've already learned, separation of powers and checks and balances, okay? So what's the difference? A lot of times students can get these two ideas kind of confused or intermixed. Separation of powers is kind of a division amongst branches, but also division basically amongst what those branches do, their jobs. Okay, so separation of powers, we know it's the legislative branch's job to create laws. It's the executive branch's job to enforce those laws, and the judicial branch's job is to interpret those laws. So those defined roles is what we mean by separation of powers. Checks and balances is the ability of each branch to kind of limit or check the powers of the other two branches. So again, think like a presidential veto is a check on the power of the legislative branch. The Supreme Court's ability to rule a law unconstitutional is a check on the legislative branch, things like that. So where does this all kind of start? And I told you if you watched yesterday's video that I would explain Federalist 51 a little bit better today, and here we go. So Fed 51 is written by James Madison, and it's all about those two ideas, separation of powers and checks and balances. If you're one of those people like me that really likes those kind of mnemonic devices or little simple reminders as to how to remember the topic of a certain paper, think Federalist 51, the 5 kind of looks like an S, I guess. So separation of powers, it's not as good as the factions one, but it's something, okay? So in Fed 51, remember the point of the Federalist Papers is always going to be to try to get the Constitution ratified, to get this thing approved. And one of the biggest fears that people had was tyranny, right? We just had this tyrant in King George III. People are scared that if we give the federal government too much power, we're going to basically have traded in one tyrant for another tyrant. So Madison is kind of addressing those concerns here. He's going through and saying that the government is going to be divided up into levels. There's going to be state governments, national governments that are going to have different powers. So this idea of federalism comes up here. So don't worry, if you live in New York, you're not going to be only under the rule of this big tyrant, the president. There's going to be checks on his power. There's going to be things that your state government can do that the federal government cannot do, and vice versa. Okay. And the idea is kind of this, that by having multiple levels to government and having checks on government, that there's access point for people to influence that public policy, that you as an American citizen are going to have easier access to people in charge of the government. Okay. Sorry, I'm by the door again because I'm watching my dogs. It's getting a little windy behind me. I apologize. So talking a little bit more about this. So when Madison comes up with this idea, if somebody was to, let's say, abuse their power, right? Let's pretend, for example, that George Washington, the first president, comes out and says, you know what, I'm King George Washington now. Madison's trying to assure the American people that he would not be able to do all the types of things that a king would do. That the legislative branch could check his power, the judicial branch could check his power, the states would have powers that were able to prevent him from having this kind of tyrannical rule. Okay. So outside of Federalist 51, what does this turn into inside the Constitution? Where do we see these? So we know separation of powers exists, we know checks and balances exist, but it also gets us into the actual Constitution itself and the rules on impeachment and removal of a president. To basically, if a ruler does get out of hand, if a ruler does abuse their power, hey guys, guess what? We're going to have a way to get rid of that ruler. Okay? So why would we impeach a president? Treason, bribery, then this kind of vague term, other high crimes and misdemeanors, right? We know from Donald Trump's impeachment that apparently you can impeach a president you know, for talking to another government, that quid pro quo thing that he liked to talk about this whole year, right? Um, but basically, just kind of a quick review of how this impeachment works. You guys should be experts because we followed the impeachment this year. But the House of Representatives is going to basically go through, need a simple majority to impeach the president. They kind of act more as the grand jury. So, what's the evidence say? Is there enough to try to impeach him? And then, if they get a simple majority, the president is impeached. So, remember, being impeached does not mean being removed from office. Okay. So the Senate, if we go over to this side, the Senate acts as the jury. So now that the president's been impeached, he goes on trial. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is going to be kind of the presiding judge over that. And the Senate is going to have kind of evidence heard. They're going to ask questions. They're going to call witnesses, things like that, like you would see in a normal courtroom. And they need a 2/3 majority to remove the president then from office. Okay. And impeachment can happen for really any federal position. Okay, a Supreme Court justice could be impeached, um, a senator could be impeached, a member of the House could be impeached. Okay, and again, it's just an easy example of checks and balances. The ability to impeach the president is a check on his power, which is what Madison was getting at in Federalist 51. Okay, so that's really big idea three. That's all it really is that we put in these things into checks and balances and separation of government to make sure that the people have direct access to their government. We're not going to have tyranny, and that we're going to protect freedoms and protect liberty. Okay, and that gets us into big idea four, the last big idea that we'll talk about, which is federalism. And we know that through Federalist 51 that Madison already has kind of thought up this idea of federalism, right? There's going to be different layers to our government. We have the federal government at the top, because remember, he's a federalist. He wants a strong federal government, state governments in the middle, local governments underneath those state governments. Okay. So in federalism, you do need to know these powers. Okay. In those words. So expressed and enumerated, concurrent, and reserved powers. All right. Think about if you go to dinner, right? You have a reservation. That means that a table is going to be held for you. So in federalism, and we'll talk about implied powers too. Sorry, I should have talked about that one earlier. In federalism, we have these expressed or enumerated powers that are given to the national government. So basically, powers that are explicitly given to Congress in the Constitution, things that Congress can do that cannot be taken away from them. So levy taxes, regulate commerce and currencies. So basically, regulating American trade, making sure we have a national currency, what money gets printed, things like that. The ability to declare war and raise an army, right? The federal government can do that. New York State cannot. Tomorrow, we as citizens of New York State can't say, oh, let's go declare war on Canada. It doesn't work that way, right? We can allow foreigners to become citizens. They have authority over the Army and Navy, things like that, make treaties, et cetera, okay? Implied powers, so if you hear that word implied, it means it's not directly said, but we kind of all agree that it's something that they can do, okay? So if I said, you know, hey, I didn't tell you that you needed to put your phone away, but it was implied, right? Maybe you saw me take another student's phone away in class and you didn't put yours away, so I take yours. And I can say, well, it's kind of implied when I took her phone away that I could also do that, right? And take yours. Same idea here with national powers. So they're express powers. They're inferred from that. Congress can carry out its functions as needed. Excuse me. Ooh. Concurrent powers. You might have learned this in science class. Concurrent powers, right? If we have two currents running kind of in the same direction, powers held jointly by the national and state government. Both New York State and the federal government can collect taxes. They can set up courts. They can create laws. They can set a minimum wage. They can charter banks. Those are powers that both the states and the federal government have. And then reserved powers. So again, think about that table at a restaurant. We're holding this for you. This is just yours. In this case, you are a state, right? So powers not specifically granted to the federal government or denied to the states, things that the states can do. So regulating trade, we don't mean like regulating trade in the sense of that New York State's going to go and make a special trade deal with China. We mean regulating like trade that New York can send apples to California, or Boston, Massachusetts can send lobsters across the country, things like that, right? Marriage laws, conducting elections, local governments, schools. The states could set up their own schools, things like that. So these powers in federalism, right, are basically just setting the stage for limiting that same fear of tyranny that we talked about. Hey guys, look, your states are going to keep this power. The government's not going to have all the power. The states are going to be able to do some of the things that the government can do, but there's going to be a few things that the federal government can do that makes it kind of the supreme government. But there's also going to be a few things that only the states can do that the federal government cannot. Okay, so we're easing people's minds about the role of the government. With this whole idea of federalism comes these kind of crazy terms that we talked about in the beginning of the year, but we didn't necessarily review before this whole coronavirus outbreak. So some of those terms, if you want to read through them, I'm not going to go through each one in the video. I will talk about two that can be a little tricky. So categorical grants versus block grants, okay? And if you see categorical, what word seems to be present in categorical? Category, right? So they're basically grants that can only be used for specific categories of the state and local spending. So basically what happens is the government gives states or local governments money in the form of a grant that has to be used for a specific purpose. So we have the Head Start program listed here. This would be, an educational grant. It's basically, here's money, but there's strings attached, so you can only use this money for this thing. All right, so if the government gave New York State money in a categorical grant for education, New York State couldn't decide to go use that money to clean up its beaches. It wouldn't be able to do that. Okay, so categorical grants, strings attached. They have to fit the specific category. A block grant is a little bit different. Okay, so they're more or less given automatically to states or communities to support broad programs. Okay, so if you might remember, we talked a little bit about the Buffalo Billion before break, right? That the city of Buffalo was given $1 billion to help develop the city and things like that. So if we have a grant that's considered a block grant that's either given out by the federal government, it's basically going to be able to be used by the state or local government however they see the best fit for it. Okay, so like the Buffalo Billion's used to develop canal side and things like that. So not as many strings attached. So if you're a state or a local government, you would much rather prefer to get a block grant from the federal government than a categorical grant because you can use the money really however you want. Okay. So if you look at the bottom, just kind of to summarize grants here, it says federal grants, incentives, and aid programs give states freedom to implement social programs to advance disadvantaged groups. Power is balanced between the federal and state governments. Okay, so think welfare programs. These grants are going to be used to kind of balance out that power between federal and state governments and also provide direct aid and support to the people, which is, again, if we talk about why the Constitution is written the way it is, we're trying to put people's minds at ease, make it seem like the government is on their side all the time. Okay. Last thing, and then tomorrow I decided I'll make a second, kind of another video on these court cases, just to keep the video short enough to keep your attention, hopefully. So last couple things with balancing power between national and state governments. The Bill of Rights is not part of the original Constitution. A lot of people get that confused. They think, oh, like the Bill of Rights was written in immediately. The Anti-Federalists want to approve a Constitution without the Bill of Rights. Partially true. The Anti-Federalists wanted the Bill of Rights included in the Constitution in order to ratify it. But basically what happens is the Constitution is ratified with the intention that the Bill of Rights will be added. So remember, the word amend, to amend something means to change it. So the first 10 amendments we see in the Bill of Rights are kind of the first 10 changes made to the Constitution or additions to the Constitution. So the first one that's going to kind of fit into this federalism category here is the 10th Amendment. And the 10th Amendment is outwardly saying, hey, we have powers reserved to the states. Any power not given to the federal government or denied to the states in the Constitution is reserved for the states. So we have 10th Amendment, here's federalism, the general idea for it, okay? But since then, a couple other things, one amendment, a couple clauses here that come on early that are going to show this balance of power. The 14th Amendment gives citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States. This should not say, sorry. 13th Amendment frees the slaves. This is another example that could fit in. The 14th Amendment grants citizenship. Typos. So with the 13th and 14th Amendments, basically what the federal government was able to do is they were able to use their power over the states. So in federalism, this idea of the states having powers, there's nothing in the Constitution originally that says the government can free all the slaves. 14th Amendment kind of gives the government that power, which could be an example of the necessary and proper clause or the elastic clause. So the idea being, though, again, federal government's supreme, so whatever they say goes. So after the federal government frees all the slaves, New York State couldn't pass a law in 2020 that says, hey, you can own slaves here. Okay. Same thing, the Commerce Clause. Congress has the power to regulate business activities that cross state lines. So New York State has control of all the business that takes place within the state. So think like a local company. So Pizza Logs, right? The original Pizza Logs, I don't know if you guys know this, they're a Buffalo-based company. They can do whatever they want in terms of operating inside New York State and only have to really be regulated by the state of New York. But if Pizza Logs decides that they want to ship their pizza logs across the country, Congress technically has the power to regulate that business activity because it crosses state lines. What that does, why it's created, is because it's going to basically protect states from each other. The federal government kind of gets to be the deciding factor. It kind of limits the tension created between states if one side has a more favorable agreement than the other. Prevents New York from saying, cool, we really like California, but we hate Texas, so we're going to give them a better deal. Okay? And then the necessary and proper clause, before we wrap things up, Congress has the power to make all laws that are necessary and proper to carry out the powers of the Constitution. This is the most important clause. I said possibly originally, but I'm telling you now, this is the one that you need to know. Okay. Also known as the elastic clause. So think elastic stretches, right? All of you guys are probably sitting here in your pajamas or sweatpants because you're not leaving the house. So just stretch that waistband, it gets bigger, right? So with the necessary and proper clause, the power of the federal government is going to expand like that elastic band. They can do more than what was originally allowed in the Constitution. Okay. So that's it for today with big ideas 3 and 4. I'll finish up tomorrow with some court cases that are in Unit 1, just to kind of reiterate a few things. Please ask questions. 2 days in a row or 2 sessions in a row, I've had kids from every class besides my AP class on my live office hours. I really want you guys kind of honing in and studying for this test. So please reach out to me. Take it on yourselves. You want to pass this thing. You want to get college credit, and you're more than capable of doing so. All right. So take care. Have a good day. I'll talk to you soon.